Halloween, everyone! Even though this video may very well come out after the 31st. Depends on how quickly I can edit it. Hi, I'm Kate, and today we're going to be talking about a spooky subject, as you've probably guessed based on the title of this video. The Tower of London and those spirits rumored to exist within its walls. I am sort of dressed for Halloween. I have orange and black, and I have my little black kitty cat earrings on, so hopefully you guys have something more interesting to wear for Halloween, but this is what I have and I'm working with it. So let's get into the video. Although the tower itself may be well known as a tourist spot for displaying many of the crown jewels, the famous yeoman warders, aka the beefeaters, and for the ravens who, according to legend, if they ever leave, Britain and the monarchy will fall. And despite the fact that the tower has been somewhat of a tourist spot for hundreds of years, to some extent, it has a very long and often dark history going back close to 1,000 years now. The original buildings date back to William the Conqueror, who had the White Tower, the famous White Tower, built, which is the earliest stone keep in England. And his son, also named William, had a wall built around the tower. And this was sort of the beginning of the buildings that we know of today, which has obviously been expanded upon throughout the years. The tower has been a royal residence, as well as a prison and a place of execution, the latter two being the main source of the supposed ghost activity. Although there are certainly deaths that occurred there dating back earlier, the first person that we're going to talk about today is Henry VI. And this guy is also known as the Mad King, although, let's face it, there have been plenty of those. Henry was born in late 1421 and became king almost immediately, with his father dying less than a year later. He was not a fantastic leader, to put it lightly, and at this time he was actually the heir to the thrones of both England and France, but France wasn't too happy about that, and they were doing much better than he was at the time, such as with the Dauphin and Joan of Arc. So he lost a lot of territory in France, and in the 1450s he basically had a mental breakdown for a couple years, during which he was unable to rule, and pretty much as soon as he was back in control, a little squabble called the Wars of the Roses broke out. Maybe you've heard of it. And Henry fled, was captured, was restored as king, and was defeated again, and then was imprisoned in the tower. And this is where soon afterwards he met his ultimate fate. Some said initially that he died of an illness, but it is much more likely that he was assassinated, allegedly by being stabbed as he was praying in the Wakefield Tower Chapel. And supposedly, on the anniversary of his murder, his ghost is said to appear in the chapel, pacing until the stroke of midnight, the time when he was supposedly killed. The man who replaced Henry as king, Edward IV, while a better leader, ultimately didn't have much of a longer legacy. When he died in 1483, his young sons, Edward and Richard, were left in the custody of Edward IV's brother, Richard. They weren't very creative with names back then. This Richard was, of course, Richard III, who promptly housed his nephews in the Tower of London. It was the royal residence at the time, so this wasn't necessarily a dungeon that they were in, as is often depicted. Not long afterwards, however, Richard convinced Parliament that his late brother's marriage had not been valid, and therefore his children, the two boys, were illegitimate. Richard then became Richard III, and his nephews soon disappeared from the tower. This was likely on Richard's orders, but there are a ton of theories, enough that I could and possibly will make a video just on this mystery someday. And the spirits of these two boys have supposedly been seen playing together, dressed in white nightshirts. People have also reported seeing similarly dressed figures holding hands and going up and down stairs or clutching each other in fear. Children's laughter has also been reported throughout the tower buildings and grounds, so either they're having a really bad time or just having fun. Next, we're really going to get into the famous executions portion of this video, starting with, of course, perhaps the most famous, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was famously, or infamously, the second wife of Henry VIII, who, when she couldn't immediately give birth to a son, was quickly tossed aside. She was thoroughly slandered, being accused of adultery, including with her own brother, as well as other stuff, including being a witch. They went to town on her. And their marriage was actually annulled, which would actually make the whole adultery thing not applicable, even if it was true, which it probably wasn't. But that didn't matter. Henry was in control, and he wanted her gone. She was notably humble during the preceding minutes to the execution, making a speech that didn't admit any wrongdoing, but also absolving the king from any blame, likely in an attempt to protect her remaining family and her daughter Elizabeth. Anne is likely the most famous ghostly presence in the tower, possibly because she's probably the most famous person that was killed there, usually appearing near the area where her execution likely took place, as well as the chapel. She is supposedly often seen walking around headless or with her head held under her arm. One person even claimed to have seen a royal procession with Anne included in it, walking across the courtyard. Another victim of Henry VIII's temper was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury and a niece to Kings Edward IV and Richard III. She was a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon and had a somewhat contentious relationship with Henry. She was loyal to the couple's daughter Mary and refused to give Mary's valuables back to Henry after the girl was declared illegitimate, and tried to keep serving Mary even just on her own, but was not allowed. Henry supposedly called Margaret, quote, a fool of no experience, end quote. One of Margaret's son, Reginald, also clashed with Henry pretty badly, to put it lightly, even trying to get him deposed. Reginald was actually made a cardinal, which additionally conflicted with Henry's Protestant government. And it was so bad with Reginald that at one point Henry even tried to have him assassinated, but he left the country. So all of this ultimately resulted in basically the entire family getting ruined. Although some of them probably did do enough to sort of warrant some punishment, in what was probably a setup, they all lost their titles and land, and several members of the family, including Margaret, were ultimately executed. And this was mostly because they could not get to Reginald himself. And it's possible that Margaret didn't even necessarily completely understand why she was being held, because she was very adamant that she was innocent of anything. Before she was executed, Margaret was held in the tower for 2 years, and in her cell a poem was found carved into the wall. Quote, "For traitors on the block should die, I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards the block I shall not go, nor make one step, as you shall see. Christ, in thy mercy, save thou me." End quote. Supposedly, the regular executioner was not available when it was time for her to be executed, so another man filled in who badly botched the execution, supposedly having to hit her multiple times before she died. There are even some versions of the events that have her completely refusing to cooperate and being chased down by the executioner as he took swings at her. People have reportedly heard frequent screams near the place she was supposedly executed, and some even claim to have seen ghostly reenactments of the events. Next, I'm going to talk about Lady Jane Grey and Lord Guildford Dudley. Lady Jane happened to be pretty unlucky. She never really did anything that bad herself, as she was only 16 years old or so when she died, but had the misfortune to be a Protestant cousin of Edward VI, Henry's only legitimate son. She was essentially used in order to keep Edward's original heir, his older Catholic sister, Mary, from getting the throne. While Henry's sixth wife had convinced him to reinstate Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, they were eventually declared illegitimate again when it became clear that Edward was dying, which sealed Jane's fate. When Edward died in 1553, Jane did technically become queen for 9 days, until Mary, who had a lot of popular support, even eventually the support of Jane's own father, who was trying to save himself, had Jane, her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, and Jane's father imprisoned in the Tower. Jane's father did manage to get pardoned, but Jane and Dudley were tried for treason and sentenced to death. The sentence was actually suspended briefly. They knew it wasn't going to be very popular to have them executed, but after Jane's father supported a rebellion Early the next year, Jane, Dudley, and her father were all executed. Great father. Dudley was executed first, and supposedly his body was then taken past the rooms where Jane was staying, and she was very traumatized. When she was brought to the scaffold for her own execution, she was blindfolded and unable to find the chopping block and had to be helped over to it. Dudley's ghost is said to haunt the cell in which he was kept, weeping at night, while Jane's spirit is said to be wandering the battlements alone. Her father, nowhere to be seen. Catholic convert Guy Fawkes, or as he preferred to be called, Guido, got involved in the gunpowder plot to assassinate King James and blow up Parliament. This is pretty well-known information. He'd previously served in the military and had some explosives experience, supporting various Catholic causes, primarily for Spain. When James became king, Fawkes described him as a heretic. When someone involved in this plot decided to try and warn Catholic members of Parliament so that they could stay away on the night that the event was supposed to take place, they sent an anonymous letter. The letter was then shown to the king, who ordered a search of the cellars underneath Parliament. There, Fawkes, who had been given the job of actually lighting the gunpowder, was found, along with many barrels of gunpowder. Fawkes fully admitted to intending to kill everyone, and only said that he regretted that he wasn't able to follow through. He did initially give a fake name, possibly to help protect the other members of the plot, and James supposedly admired Fawkes' courage for that, but still ordered him to be tortured. Though he held out for quite some time, Fawkes eventually did fess up, confessing his real name and the names of his co-conspirators. All were found guilty of high treason and were sentenced to death by being drawn and quartered after being hung. And while the others supposedly died slowly, he somehow broke his neck either by falling or jumping before he was supposed to, and was given a quicker death than the others. While his more famous post-death hangout is a cottage where he possibly lived at one point, now known as the Guy Fawkes Inn, it is also said that you can hear his screams in the White Tower where he was tortured. Next is Arbella Stewart, and I find her very interesting. She was the great-great-granddaughter of King Henry VII, and was at one point considered as a successor for Queen Elizabeth before James was ultimately regarded as preferable. Although Arbella didn't seem to have any ambition to be queen herself, others saw her as a rallying point in a plot to overthrow James. Those involved in the plot contacted her, and she immediately notified James. And although various people tried to get Arbella to marry various other people, usually in an attempt to gain influence in court, Arbella refused multiple marriage offers. Eventually, she did marry. She married a man named William Seymour, who was the great-nephew of Lady Jane Grey, so they were actually like cousins distantly, but that was not unusual back then. Unfortunately, the two got married without permission from the king, which was a big no-no. Additionally, since both Arbella and William were in the line of succession, them teaming up was seen as a possible precursor to a grab at the throne. When he found out, James had them imprisoned. They were imprisoned in separate locations, and the couple was still able to communicate a little bit through letters until James stopped it, and they came up with a plan. The couple disguised themselves, Arbella dressing in men's clothing, and escaped. They got pretty far, actually, but Arbella's ship was caught by James's men before she was able to reach her destination and be reunited with her husband. She was then sent to the Tower, where she died in September of 1615, either from a refusal to eat or being refused food. Her spirit is said to haunt the Queen's house, supposedly the most haunted building in the Tower, and people have reported being shoved or even waking in the night with a feeling like they were being strangled, acts that have been attributed to Arbella. The explorer Sir Walter Raleigh had a very up-and-down relationship with England's royalty, sometimes being a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, but also being imprisoned in the Tower 3 separate times. Once for over 10 years before eventually being beheaded during the reign of James I. He was imprisoned the first time after marrying one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting without the Queen's permission. We've already gone over that. That's a big no-no. The second time, he was imprisoned for participating in the plot to replace James with Arbella Stewart. even though he may not have actually been that involved in it. The third and last time he was imprisoned was for his actions during an expedition to find the fabled El Dorado, which included his men attacking a Spanish outpost, which violated a peace treaty with Spain. While Raleigh himself was not involved and was unaware that the attack was going on until after it happened, he was sentenced to death in order to appease Spain. And this guy was a poet, so he was very dramatic during his execution, telling the executioner, quote, "Let us dispatch. At this hour my ague comes upon me. I would not have my enemies think I quaked from fear," end quote. And in reaction to being shown the axe, quote, "This is a sharp medicine, but it is a physician for all diseases and miseries," end quote. And finally, his last words were supposedly, quote, "What dast thou fear? Strike, man, strike," end quote. Afterwards, his head was embalmed and given to his wife, who was said to have carried it in a velvet bag until her death almost 30 years later. Raleigh's body was eventually reunited with his head, and his spirit supposedly appears often, carrying his head, which is said to be dripping blood. A man named E.L. Smith was the keeper of the crown jewels for about 40 years in the early to mid-1800s, and he lived in the tower with his family. One day, while sitting with his family, he said that his wife suddenly looked up and said, quote, "Good God, what is that?" end quote. When Swift looked up, he saw a, quote, "cylindrical figure, like a glass tube, seemingly about the thickness of my arm," end quote. It was hovering above a table and was filled with what appeared to be a cloudy liquid. After floating for a couple minutes, he said it moved over behind his wife and apparently attacked her in some way. Quote, "Instantly she crouched down, and with both hands covering her shoulder, she shrieked out, 'Oh Christ, it has seized me!' end quote. What the heck that was, I have no idea. There's not a whole lot of information about it aside from that. But shortly after that event, Swift wrote of another strange event at the tower. As a bit of backstory, starting hundreds of years before, the tower was also a host to an exotic animal menagerie, which included gifts of animals given by foreign leaders mostly. And these included lions, elephants, and even a white bear, who was probably a polar bear. And this polar bear was supposedly allowed to swim for fish in the Thames. According to Swift, a sentry saw something that looked like a, quote, "huge bear," end quote, coming out from under a door and stabbed it with his bayonet, which then got stuck in the door. Swift wrote, quote, "Of all this I avouch nothing more than that I saw the poor man in the guardhouse prostrated with terror, and that in 2 or 3 days the fatal result was that he died." So, ending on that note, that's all I have for you today. I hope everyone has, or had, if this comes out after Halloween, a safe and happy Halloween, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.